This series has been fun for me, tracing our evolution through the Proterozoic, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras and their periodic subsets. But now we've reached the point where paleontology blends into archaeology. We're no longer looking at some other geologic period. We're now into the Quaternary, the period we currently live in. It starts with the Pleistocene epoch, which began 2,580,000 years ago. This marks the first time in the history of animal life on land when the Earth had permanently frozen ice caps at both poles. The Pleistocene differs from prior Pliocene, and indeed all other previous periods, in that this was when the normally stable and continuously warm environment suddenly became erratic, fluctuating in a series of 20 cycles of intermittently warm stages, shifting to intensely cold ice ages just within a relatively short period of 2.5 million years. Reducing the global average temperature by a mere 5 degrees changed everything. Tropical areas were the least affected, being almost the same environment as they are now, but in a narrower band as the temperate zones encroached at lower latitudes than before. Some jungles became deciduous forests, and some got snow in the winter where there was never a winter before. The climate we have in the southern part of Europe and in the United States back then was more like the northern parts of those continents are now, and the northern forests there now were more like the Arctic tundra back then. During the Pleistocene glacial maximum, colder regions, like the entire area of Canada, for example, were utterly uninhabitable, being covered by vast sheets of ice up to 2 miles thick. And consequently, worldwide sea levels were at the lowest they'd ever been since land was inhabited, such that it was possible to walk from continental Europe to the British Isles or from Malaysia to Bali without ever getting your feet wet. So that's what people did. We're talking about human migration today. Until now, each episode of the series explained the taxonomic categories to which we all belong, not just the 7 original ranks that Carolus Linnaeus came up with in 1735, but also myriad new additions discovered since then. And now that we've covered every named clade we currently know of in the human lineage, all the way down to our genus and species, I'll do this one more episode to compare the human races that once existed with the one race that remains. If you thought there was more than one race now, it's because the use of the word race has significantly changed over the last couple hundred years. The way that word is most commonly used today more accurately refers to ethnicity or to demes, which can also be ethnic. A deme is an isolated population within the larger gene pool. They exist everywhere, or they did until recently, but they're neither as isolated nor as distinct as some make them out to be. Often race actually refers to clines. A cline is a geographical gradient where particular traits in a single species look different in other geographic areas. These characteristics can be phenotypic, like hair color, skin pigmentation, stature, and other observable external biological traits, or they can be genotypic, like having ABO blood type or the sickle cell hemoglobin. All the differences between modern humans are merely clinal, not actually racial. And some folks think that the variety of people around the world are like different breeds of human, as if race refers to a subspecies classification. But that would require diagnostic physical characteristics and/or behavioral propensities to be shared by every member of their group and not shared with any member of another group. We don't have that for any alleged race today. The differences in living people are neither uniquely distinct enough to be diagnostic nor consistently discontinuous enough to qualify as a taxonomic category, being more of a scale of probabilities and percentages rather than definitive distinctions, meaning that the people today are not different races by the biological definition, but they are by the social definition. Using the word race instead of ethnic demes or clines has only caused confusion, as always happens whenever one word has multiple definitions applied interchangeably. The word race is used today as a social construct, with variable applications that are important to different people for different reasons, often dependent on local politics. But it's not a biological term like it used to be, and it has no biological significance or value with respect to the level of diversity we have in our species currently. And back in Darwin's day, the word race meant the descendant lineage of a particular species. In his book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, Darwin was not referring to people. Instead, he talked about races of cabbages and how certain other lineages or races of animal species survived while other dependent lineages went extinct. Now, back in the 1700s, Carolus Linnaeus knew that the people of Europe had a typical appearance collectively recognizable as European, And he compared that to the average appearance of people on other continents to conclude that they must be different races, by which he meant that they were different species, not biologically related to each other. And then he added his own erroneous pejorative assumptions about their character, the way races have always done and still do today. Linnaeus lived 100 years before Darwin, and he didn't know that evolution was even possible. He didn't believe that new species could come about any other way than by a special creation by God. So he thought that what he categorized as white people, red people, yellow people, black people, chimpanzee people, and orangutan people were all different species of human, and that God had created each of these 6 races separately. A century later still wasn't any better. One of Darwin's contemporaries, anthropologist Louis Agassiz, thought that there were 8 races of people that had been separately and specially created by God, and Agassiz believed that the first 4 chapters of Genesis only tell about the origin of the white race. That was a common belief at that time. And somehow, despite centuries of progress and scientific discovery since then, there are people who still believe that, and quite a lot of them, I'm sorry to say. And back in Darwin's day, it wasn't just creationists who believed in different races. There were also polygenists who imagined that each race of humanity evolved separately, with some people descending from chimpanzees, independent of other alleged races evolving from gorillas or orangutans. As absurd as all that is, it was a popular notion back then, and Darwin was the first one to speak out against it. Not just clarifying that we didn't evolve from any living species of apes, Darwin also publicly called out his contemporaries who couldn't agree on how many races there even are, or how to distinguish them. And Darwin pointed out that there is no distinction, that all the imagined races blend into each other gradually, showing that there is only one race, the human race. A few years later, and other anthropologists like Franz Boas also voiced their agreement that Darwin was right about that. In 1950, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, issued a statement asserting that all humans belong to the same species and that race is not a biological reality but a myth. And now we have molecular evidence to prove it. Genetic analyses indicate that 85 to 92% of total human diversity is found within populations, and that only 8 to 15% of variation is found between even continental populations, meaning that there is no characteristic consistent throughout any alleged race and no gaps between them either. Now, these findings conflict with popular notions of distinct and relatively homogeneous human races, and they call into question the value of classification in, for example, medical diagnostics. And personally, I doubt the necessity of any form asking us to mark which of their racial categories applies to us. I don't see why that matters, especially not when I know so many people, even in my own family, who have to mark 2 or 3 of these boxes at the same time. What difference does it make? Human beings are one of the most genetically similar of all species. There's nearly 6 times more genetic variation among white-tailed deer in the southern United States than in all humans around the world. Consider our closest living relative, the chimpanzee, whose natural habitat is confined to Central Africa and parts of Western Africa. Yet 4 genetically distinct races or groups occupy these regions, and they are far more genetically distinct than humans who live on different continents. That humans exhibit such a low level of genetic variation compared to other taxa reflects the fact that we are a relatively recent species. So there are 4 races of chimpanzees and only 1 human race, though that wasn't always the case. There used to be other races, it's just that we're the last ones left. And some people think that Homo sapiens are human and that Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and others we haven't mentioned yet were not human. But remember that the word human includes every species in the genus Homo. So they were all human too, no matter how different they were from each other as well as from us. In earlier episodes, we mentioned how Kenyanthropus platyops could have been the first human species over 3 million years ago. If so, then to avoid paraphyly, the binomial should be changed accordingly, perhaps to Homo platyops, although the current name makes it a better conceptual example of transition from Australopiths to humans. Otherwise, the earliest species accepted as human are Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, both from 1.5 to 2.5 million years ago. After that came Homo erectus, also known as Homo ergaster in Africa, and originally known as Pithecanthropus erectus. All of the human species mentioned so far have been found in and around Kenya in East Africa. The oldest specimens of Homo erectus were from Africa too, but they've also been found in the Middle East and in southern Europe all the way to Gibraltar and throughout southern Asia and the islands of Indonesia. So they were the first human race to get out of Africa, and they spread far and wide. Remember that artificial and natural selection work in different directions at very different speeds, such that different breeds can generate a huge amount of skeletal diversity while they're still chemically interfertile. Natural selection, however, is much slower, so that by the time there is significant variance in the skeleton, they're usually distinct species. Foundational, reproductive, or developmental variations are relatively rare. The typical condition is that of incremental, superficial changes being slowly compiled atop successive tiers of fundamental similarity, meaning that closely related species tend to change on the outside more than on the inside. And the more distantly related two animals are, the deeper those differences go. The longer two divided populations remain isolated from each other, the more they grow apart and the more visibly distinct they appear to be. Look how diverse the ethnic teams of humanity have become just over the last 70,000 years or so. But remember that there has always been at least some interbreeding between all of these groups, always some connection to everyone else. Whereas some tribes of Homo erectus had dispersed into remote corners of the world much more isolated from everyone and not interbreeding with anyone but their nearest neighbors for well more than 1 million years. So how different from each other had they become? Homo erectus was by far the longest lasting and most diverse human race, with a range of roughly 8,000 miles wide across 3 continents, including Europe, at a time when deliberate travel could not include a destination because no one knew where anything was or that there was anything there. The only way to get anywhere was by walking barefoot through unexplored and sometimes inhospitable wilderness amongst dangerous wild animals much bigger and badder than what we have left today. So various tribes of these early migrants found themselves almost entirely separated from each other, not just by great distances, but also by a vast expanse of time. We're talking about 100,000 generations, during which the people then living in Asia or Africa never saw anyone from Indonesia or Europe. So just imagine how much these absolutely isolated groups had grown apart over all those thousands of centuries. For example, 1,650,000 years ago in the eastern European border with Asia, one group of erectines only averaged about 5 feet high, with tiny brains, half the size of ours, only 100 cc's larger than that of a chimpanzee. But at the same time, erectines in Africa were already taller than that by 10 years old, and the adults were as big as me, with brains twice the size of a chimp's and 3/4 of our current average capacity. Individual people can have any number of defects, and modern human populations can have this kind of variance in height, but not in brain size. That is an enormous difference in a fundamental trait, way beyond any popular notions we hear about what are called races living today. Modern people groups do not even approach that level of variance. And that's just what we can see from the bones, which are profoundly different from ours, especially the skulls. So imagine how different their faces must have looked, not just from us, but from each other too. If we lived among erectines, we'd be able to tell just by looking at them whether they came from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, East Asia, Northern Africa, or wherever. But quicker than that, you'd also be able to tell at a glance that they were definitely not us. Homo erectus was way more diverse than Homo sapiens ever were, enough to render our current popular notions of race laughable. They differed from us so much that if they were still around, we would not see our own races divided into sub-races anymore, especially not when we add actual races like Homo antecessor and Homo naledi, both of whom lived alongside erectus but before sapiens. Having them around would force us to recognize that all Homo sapiens are the same race as compared with these other 3 distinct races that once existed before us. Because modern ethnic groups have very little difference outside of appearance, whereas those other races in the fossil record had more significant differences that ran deeper down. If Homo erectus, antecessor, and naledi are the grandparents in our story of human evolution, then our father is Homo heidelbergensis. This one species lived in Africa, where anatomically modern Homo sapiens emerged some 300,000 years ago. But they also lived in Europe and in the Middle East, where they evidently fathered our brothers, the Neanderthals and Denisovans. The differences between these older siblings and our own race was similar to J.R.R. Tolkien's elves and dwarves as compared to
The race of men who, above all else, desire power.
There were significant biological differences between us. For example, Neanderthals had larger eyes and were physically adapted to a colder climate. They were also stronger and much hardier than us, and they had a larger brain than we do. But it was a different shape. They had more hindbrain, but a smaller cerebellum than we have, which is important for both motor skills and higher cognition, including language processing, learning, reasoning, and social abilities. So even as similar as they were, they didn't think or act like us. Analysis of their DNA found that Neanderthals could be divided into 3 subgroups, one in Western Europe, and one in Southern Europe, and a third in Western Asia. So, just as Homo sapiens has a variety of ethnic themes, so did the race of Neanderthals. There are much more significant differences between Neanderthals and sapiens than there are within or between any 2 populations of people living today, but we could still produce fertile sapiens-Neanderthal hybrids. In Europe, Neanderthals apparently kept moving, trying to evade us until they eventually ran out of places where they could keep to themselves. There was some interbreeding, enough early on that everyone outside of Africa probably has a tiny percentage of Neanderthal DNA, but interbreeding was still very rare, like only one admixture event every 1,000 years or so. Thus, we can guess that Neanderthals apparently didn't like us, but Denisovans did. In Asia, Denisovans blended into populations of sapiens, such that remnants of their genome are now found in some Tibetans and Malaysians, as well as Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians. And most of the evidence we have of Denisovans is found in ghost lineages in the genomes of these modern people. Interestingly, DNA extracted from 160,000-year-old Denisovan remains just barely detected the faint trace of another ghost lineage in their genome too, probably that of Homo erectus. It was often assumed that modern people are divided into 3 races, or maybe a half a dozen races, or maybe more, who knows. But the direct-to-consumer genetic testing service known as 23andMe assigns about 500 haplogroups for the Y chromosome and another 750 haplogroups for mitochondrial DNA. I think of haplogroups as the 1,250 or so branches of the modern human genetic family tree, and haplotypes, being further genetic refinements or variants of these groups of shared mutations, as the leaves on each of those branches. The deepest mitochondrial lineages are in Africa, meaning that Africans have the greatest genetic diversity. Despite this, the majority of African diversity has been classified in one letter, L, which is subsequently subdivided into L1, L2, and L3 haplogroups. As you can see in this phylogenetic tree, the L1 cluster has the deepest lineages, some of which are now known as L0. And the haplogroups of most of the alphabet that characterize the lineages outside of Africa are actually a subset of the L3 cluster, meaning that our collective paternity test shows that we are all African. You can see this more clearly here, where we focus on the African lineages in particular, with the L1 lineages that are the deepest, followed by L2, then L3 lineages in that order. This points to the most recent common ancestor of all humanity being in Africa between 140,000 and 290,000 years ago, according to a molecular clock analysis of significant mutation rates. Within L3, the sublineages M and N then contain the haplogroups found everywhere else in the world. So the root of everyone's genetic ancestry traces back to Africa, the continent with the most genotypic and phenotypic diversity, because not only is there a wide range of skin tones, but all of the traits commonly associated with any ethnic theme on other continents were all represented by indigenous people on this one. Humans have migrated out of Africa in waves, where whole tribes travel together, settling different parts of the world and leaving a genetic imprint of those migrations in what geneticists call the founder's effect. The tribe leaves with only a portion of the total original DNA, and then they continue to generate their own unique mutations as they go on. These serve as markers to identify the new population wherever they end up. The next group moving on from there does the same thing, but they start out limited by the genetic diversity of whatever subgroup they came from. So as they move on, the genome becomes less and less diverse, and their own uniquely novel mutations arise. For example, the variation in color is surprisingly recent. Genetic pathways for dark skin are different in Tamil Nadu and in Nigeria, implying that everybody started out as a reddish brown rather than black. And meanwhile, white skin with blonde hair, blue eyes, and lactose tolerance only occurred a few thousand years ago, along with red-haired people with a predominance of pheomelanin, which is why they don't tan. These unique mutations and genetic peculiarities are how we use the genome of modern people to track the migrations of their ancestors. And one of the most significant of these waves of migration happened roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago. When these migrants passed through the Middle East, they encountered and intermingled a bit with Neanderthals in the Levant, and some of those who continued to move further east eventually bonded with Denisovans too. Although that was generations later, because whole tribes of people do not move fast, especially when they don't know where they're going. At that time, there were other human races that we haven't yet mentioned, little people as small as hobbits, probably because of a phenomenon called island dwarfism. They were Homo floresiensis on Flores Island in Indonesia and Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. But we never found DNA for either of these, neither in their fossils nor in the genomes of living people. So it seems that they stayed out of the way for at least a while. As Homo sapiens grew stronger and spread further, every other race dwindled and diminished. By about 30,000 years ago, every other race of human thinned into extinction, as the whole world was eventually conquered by the race of Homo sapiens. Of course, the reason these other races all went extinct could be that soon after that, the last and longest lasting ice age began. The Younger Dryas glaciation event lasted 13,000 years, and it was the most intense, being inexplicably abrupt both in the sudden freezing to record lows and staying really cold for a really long time before rapidly warming again all the way back to Pliocene temperatures in just a few years. The Anthropocene epoch that we live in now began at the end of the Younger Dryas event 11,500 years ago, and the world has since been, on average, substantially warmer than at any time in the Pleistocene. These are the relatively mild conditions that humanity has enjoyed ever since. The return to a stable climate and made the adoption of agriculture possible, and the development of civilization inevitably resulted from that, independently arising in the Levant, in Egypt, India, China, and the Americas. This as yet unexplained rapid warming had significant impact on archaeology because as the ice melted and the glaciers retreated, the seas rose like 400 feet deeper at a rate of up to 10 feet every 100 years or so. And people built permanent villages on what was then dry land but is now underwater in the English Channel, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Sea of Galilee, among many other places. The majestic mountains that were once their horizon are mere islands now. All over the globe, human monuments were reclaimed by the rising tides, and instead of receding with the coming of a new ice age, the world is warming again. Sea levels have resumed rising, and the remaining ice caps are melting again. Only this time, we know why it's happening, and we know how to stop it, if we could just accept responsibility and admit that it's us causing it. The only thing stopping that is systematic science denial. Makes you wonder whether we named our species correctly. Are we really, man the wise? The Anthropocene epoch refers to the last 11,500 years in which human activity has caused mass extinctions of plant and animal species, polluted the oceans, and altered atmospheric, geologic, hydrologic, and other Earth systems. But we can still turn this around. We have the know-how, we have the technology, and the wherewithal to take control of our evolution and our environment and guide both to a better future. The question is, when will we?
In 1 billion years, the oceans will dry, while somehow life may continue. It will not be known to you and I. To think we are so important is an obvious crime. We know that we are specks on a tiny dot, hurtling through space and time. Yes, I understand that my whole life is just a blink of an eye in the history of the earth. It's with each moment that goes by, but this moment that I am with you, it feels like time has stood still. It feels somehow like it matters.
Don't stand up. I want you to lay down. I cannot record with you constantly tearing away at balls and boxes and toys and other dogs. Stop. Leave him alone. Lay down.